I used to think having a son meant you'd never grow old alone, that even when your hair turned gray and your bones ached, there would be someone who'd stop by not out of obligation, but out of love. That belief kept me going through a lot of hard days. Through the years when I worked double shifts at the factory, through the nights when I'd come home too tired to eat but still peek into his room just to watch him sleep, his little chest rising and falling like the world's gentlest promise. But that promise feels broken now. These days, my son only visits when it's payday. When there's something to ask for, never something to give. I never thought I'd see the day when my own flesh and blood would look at me and only see a wallet with a heartbeat. It didn't happen all at once. No, the truth is, most heartbreak doesn't. It creeps up on you, slow as rust, quiet as dust settling on an old photograph. When he was younger, Tyler used to run through the front door shouting, "Dad, guess what?" His voice would fill the house, and for those few minutes the walls felt alive again. After his mother passed, it was just the two of us. We were a team, or at least, that's what I told myself. I cooked dinners I barely knew how to make, burned half the meals, ruined the laundry, but he'd still smile and say, "It's okay, Dad, Mom would have been proud." And I believed him, because back then every word from him felt honest, pure. But somewhere between the boy who held my hand at his mother's grave and the man who now checks his watch when he visits me, something changed. He changed. I first noticed it when he started calling less. At first it was excuses. He was busy with work, busy with his girlfriend, busy finding himself. I understood. Life moves fast when you're young. You chase dreams, and sometimes you forget to look back. I told myself it was normal. But then, when he did show up, it was always around the same time at the end of the month. I'd just gotten my pension, and suddenly, there he was, smiling that smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. "Hey, Dad," he'd say, clapping my shoulder. "You look good. Been taking your meds?" He'd ask all the right questions, just long enough to soften me up before the real reason came out. "Listen, things are a little tight right now. Just till next week." And like a fool, I'd reach for my wallet. Every single time. At first, I told myself it was temporary. He was struggling. I mean, who doesn't these days? The cost of living's gone crazy, rents through the roof, and jobs don't pay what they used to. I remember thinking, he just needs a little help getting on his feet. That's what fathers are for, right, to be the safety net, to catch their kids when they fall. But the thing about always catching someone is, they stop trying not to fall. They start expecting you to be there, and one day you realize you're not a safety net anymore. You're just a habit they can't break. One Friday evening, he showed up again. I was sitting on the porch, rocking in the same old chair that's been creaking under my weight for 30 years. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors too beautiful to be wasted on someone like me. I heard his car pull up, the same beat-up sedan he's been driving for years. Except this time, there was music blasting loud enough to shake the windows. He got out wearing new sneakers. I noticed them instantly, white and spotless, the kind that don't come cheap. He hugged me, but it was one of those half-hearted hugs where the body moves but the heart doesn't. We sat for a while talking about nothing, the weather, sports, his job, and then, right on cue, came the sigh. "Dad, I hate to ask, but..." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a split second I saw that little boy again, the one who used to tug at my sleeve and say, "Dad, can we get ice cream?" But that boy was long gone. The man sitting across from me was someone else, someone who'd learned that my love could be traded for cash. So I handed him the money. He smiled, thanked me, promised to pay me back, and drove off. I watched his taillights disappear down the road and realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd said, "I love you." That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The silence was so loud, it felt like a scream. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like cardboard. My heart hurt, not in that dramatic, movie kind of way, but in the quiet, slow ache of knowing you've been taken for granted. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up worrying about him when he was a teenager, the times I'd driven across town just to pick him up from parties because I didn't want him driving drunk, the times I went without new clothes or a decent meal, just to make sure he had what he needed for school. All of it, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and now it all boiled down to this: a man who only remembered his father when his wallet felt light. It's funny, people talk about elder neglect like it's about abuse or abandonment, but sometimes the cruelest form of neglect is emotional. When your child stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a transaction. I kept asking myself, where did I go wrong? I replayed every decision I'd ever made, every word I'd ever said to him. Was I too soft, too generous? Or maybe too proud to teach him what it means to stand on his own? Because, if I'm honest, I never wanted him to struggle. After losing his mother, I swore I'd give him everything she would have wanted for him, and I did maybe too much. Maybe love without limb, it turns into something else when you're not careful, something that teaches a child not gratitude, but entitlement. The next morning, I went into town to pay my bills. As I stood in line at the bank, I saw a young man helping an older woman holding her purse, guiding her gently by the arm. She looked at him like he was her whole world, and he looked back with that kind of warmth you can't fake. It hit me then, I wanted that, not the money, not the help, just that look, that unspoken bond between a parent and child, the kind that says, you matter. I felt tears sting my eyes, and I had to look away, because deep down, I knew my son didn't look at me like that anymore. And maybe he never would again. When I got home that day, I sat down and opened my old photo album. I don't do that often, because it's like opening a wound, but I needed to remind myself that once things were different. There was this one picture, him sitting on my shoulders at the fair, cotton candy in his hand, grinning so wide you'd think he had the world figured out. I traced the outline of that photo with my finger and whispered, "Where did you go, son?" I didn't expect an answer. But something inside me shifted. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was pain. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that if I didn't do something soon, I'd lose him completely, not just as a son, but as a human being capable of love. And that's when I decided, the next time he came asking for money, I'd teach him a lesson he'd never forget. Not out of revenge, but out of love, the hard kind, the kind that doesn't come with cash, but with consequences. That night, as the house grew still, I made a plan, a small, simple plan. Because sometimes the only way to open someone's eyes is to stop giving them what they expect and start giving them what they need, the truth. I told myself I wouldn't let anger lead me, that whatever I did would come from a place of love and clarity, not spite, but planning something that would force my son to look at himself felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Every step had to be steady. For days after that night with the photo album, I watched him the way a gardener watches a tree that's begun to lean, not wanting to cut it down, only to train it so the roots can hold. I made lists the way I used to when my wife was alive, the things that mattered, the things that would matter later, and the behaviors that had crept in like mold, unseen until they took the color from the paint. There were practical things first, my bills, my medicine, the little comforts that kept me upright, the hearing aid batteries, the library book I'd been meaning to finish, the porch light that flickered in the rain. Those remained untouchable. But then there were the habits I could change that might force a conversation. The way I answered his calls immediately at 2 in the morning, the way I opened my wallet like a faucet, the way I pretended not to notice when he left crumbs of his life behind, and took only what he needed. If love had taught him to take without asking, then perhaps the next lesson would be about asking and earning, and, most of all, seeing. So I started small. I stopped answering his texts in the middle of the night. I let the phone sit there, vibrating against the table, until morning when everything looks clearer and cheaper. I started saying no, a small, steady no that tasted bitter the first few times, but grew more honest with each use. The first Saturday, he called asking for a bit of cash to cover his car battery. "Just a little, Dad. I'll swing by and get it from you." I paused, felt the old reflex itch under my skin, and let the call drop to voicemail. When he left that clipped, embarrassed message, I let it sit for a day. Then I called him back slow and measured and said, "Tyler, I can help you find the money another way. I can't keep handing it over. I'm getting old." He stammered, said he didn't mean it, that he would have fixed it himself if only he had the funds, and I could hear the practiced ease that used to soften my heart. But I kept my voice steady and offered him not cash but a plan. "Bring me the car receipt. Show me what you spent last month. Let's sit down and make a budget. I'll help you learn to patch this up." He balked at first, pride and anger, a dangerous mixture echoing an old bruise. But later that week he came over with the rolled-up receipts like a trophy someone else had won for him, and we went through them together. It was humiliating for him. It felt oddly healing for me. I didn't humiliate him, though. I pointed out patterns instead of faults, the small leaks that become floods, subscriptions he'd forgotten he'd signed up for, late fees that bled into shame, the dinners out that stacked like unread postcards. I showed him how savings, even in small amounts, accumulates like snowfall until it covers the ground. He listened, sometimes like a man hearing someone else's truth, sometimes like a child hoping for a miracle. After that, he came less often for cash and more often with questions, the kind that asked for instruction rather than alms, and I felt something in me loosen like a knot. But old habits are stubborn, and despite my newfound firmness, Payday came around and his shadow crossed the threshold again. This time I was ready. The morning he walked in that week with a worried set to his jaw and a fresh band of anxiety beneath his eyes, he tried the old approach, the smile that was almost a question, the cough that hinted at trouble, the quick mention of rent due. He reached for my hand, and I let him hold it a moment before pulling it back gently, not out of cruelty, but to make room for the words I'd rehearsed. "Son," I said, "I love you, I always will, but I won't be your ATM." He blinked, and a tiny corner of the world we'd made together cracked and fell away. For a moment he looked younger, and I could see the raw places under the surface, the fear of being seen as less than, the shame that eats at a man's pride. He lashed out with accusations, selfish, cold, ungrateful, the kind of words that sting because they're half true and half blame, but I held steady. "I'm not taking away help," I told him. "I'm changing how I give it. I'll help you get back on your feet, but not if it keeps you from learning to stand. I'll pay for a mechanic to check the car this once, but you'll come with me, and we'll set up a budget. You'll come to the food pantry with me next week, and you'll help serve. You'll work at the neighbor's yard for a few Saturdays. You'll find a part-time gig if you must." He scoffed at the chores, the food pantry. Those words wounded his pride like splinters, but I could see the gears working behind his eyes. He left that evening without cash, but with a promise that sounded more like reluctance than commitment. I slept badly that night, because love sometimes feels like punishment, and punishment can be necessary. Over the next month, we began to implement the plan. It wasn't grand or cinematic. It was messy and small and oddly beautiful. I learned that teaching a man who has been given everything is like teaching a wounded animal to walk again. It takes patience, bands of tenderness, and unblinking boundaries. We made a chart and taped it to the refrigerator. Bills, due dates, goals, and even a tiny column for pride points. Stupid, childish, but it made him laugh once, and laughter is a good mortar. On Saturdays we'd sit with coffee and go over his expenses. I taught him how to call creditors, how to ask for extensions without sounding defeated, how to prioritize rent over takeout. One cold morning we went to the pantry together. He balked at first at the line, the smiling volunteers, the eyes that looked at him with pity. But he ate the soup we served the next week, with a kind of reverence I hadn't seen since he was a boy learning to tie his shoes. He came home that night quieter, and when he said, "Thanks, Dad," it felt like a currency all its own. I also made sure he understood boundaries. When he asked for money for a locksmith because he'd locked himself out after a night he couldn't remember, I didn't reach for the checkbook. Instead, I told him to call the neighbor and offer labor. In exchange, he didn't like it, but he learned to trade work for help, and there's honor in that trade. People around us noticed the change. Neighbors who'd seen him pass our porch like a storm began to wave. Nods that became conversations. Conversations that became grudging respect. My friends at the Veterans Hall told me I was being too hard on him. Others said I was too soft. It didn't matter. This was between my son and me. But there were nights when I wondered if I'd gone too far. When he didn't come around for a week, and the silence grew heavy, I worried I'd pushed him beyond reach. Then he'd show up with a greasy bag of fries and an embarrassed grin, dropping the bag on the kitchen table as if it were a peace offering. We'd eat in silence, sometimes with the television on low, and slowly the edges softened. He began to pay me back in small ways, taking over the trash on Tuesdays, mowing the lawn, sitting with me at the foot of the bed when the thunder was loud. I don't keep score, but I noticed the ledger changing on its own. The lesson I wanted him to learn was not how to count dollars, but how to count for something larger. Integrity, responsibility, the kind of love that asks you to be better rather than feeding your... Worst, I hoped the plan would crown him with a dignity he'd misplaced somewhere between rent and receipts. Some nights, when sleep would not come, I'd think about my own father and wonder what he would have done. Would he have been softer, harsher? I pictured his face, strong and stern, the curtains of his brow, and I felt like I was aligning with him across invisible years. Whether I was right or wrong in the small cruelties of delayed indulgence, I could only act with the honesty I had left. The important thing was that he began to see. Not overnight, not in a single scene, but in small accumulations, a budget balanced, a bill paid on time, a job application filled out at the kitchen table with my shaky handwriting beside his. One rainy afternoon, as we taped up envelopes for the shelter together, he looked at me and asked quietly, "Did Mom ever?" And the rest of the sentence hung like a dropped stitch. I answered with stories instead of sermons about her stubbornness, her laughter, the way she balanced books and compassion, and I felt in that exchange a bridge mend. So the lesson continued, not as an event but as a rhythm. I could feel him learning to be a man not because he was pushed into it by shame alone, but because someone he loved me refused to let him be less. There were setbacks, of course, angry nights, slammed doors, a couple of lies that cut deeper than any blunt truth. But each time, we came back to the table, to the chart, to the small work of being human together. I never stopped loving him. I only stopped enabling him, and in that painful space, sometimes, a grown-up son finds the courage to stand. The day everything truly changed didn't start with a storm or an argument. It started with sunlight, the kind that slips through the blinds and makes everything look kinder than it really is. I woke up to the sound of birds and the faint hum of the neighbor's lawn mower. It was a good morning, calm and ordinary, the kind that fools you into thinking nothing bad could possibly happen. I made my coffee black and strong, the way I've taken it since before Tyler was born. I was flipping through the morning paper when my phone buzzed on the counter. His name lit up the screen. For a brief moment, I hoped this time it was different, that maybe he was calling just to talk. But deep down, a part of me already knew. He started with the same tone he always used when he wanted something light, apologetic, coated with charm. "Hey, Dad, how are you doing? Listen, I hate to ask, but I closed my eyes and set the paper down. It was payday again, like clockwork. He said his rent was late, that his boss was shorting him hours, that he'd been trying so hard, but just couldn't make ends meet this month. He promised he'd pay me back next Friday. He always promised that, and I always wanted to believe him. But something in me hardened this time, not out of anger, but out of resolve. It was time to give him the lesson I'd been preparing him for. "Son," I said, calm but firm, "come over. We'll talk about it in person." There was a pause, hesitation on his end. "Dad, I don't really have gas money to," I interrupted softly. "Then maybe it's time you figured out how to get here without it." He didn't like that answer. I could tell by the silence that followed. But 2 hours later, he showed up anyway. Sweaty, tired, irritated. I could see the resentment in his eyes as he stepped through the door. I had 2 envelopes waiting for him on the kitchen table. One was thick and sealed, the other empty. I motioned for him to sit. "You've come every month asking for help," I said quietly. "I've never turned you away, but I need you to see something." He frowned, clearly defensive already. "Dad, if this is another lecture about responsibility—" "It's not." I cut in. "It's about truth." I handed him the sealed envelope. "Open it." Inside was a stack of receipts. Every transaction I'd made in the past 2 years that had gone to him. The withdrawals, the money orders, even the small Venmo transfers I'd saved screenshots of. I watched as his face changed from confusion to disbelief, then to guilt. "This can't all be." "It is," I said softly. "Every dollar, every favor, every just this once." I wrote them down, not because I wanted to shame you, but because I wanted to remember how love can look when it starts hurting. His jaw clenched. "You're keeping tabs on me now," he snapped. "I'm keeping memories," I replied, "of a son who only shows up when there's something to take." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. "So what? You want me to feel bad? You think I don't already hate asking you for help?" His voice cracked on that last word, hate. That's when I saw it. The part of him that still cared, buried deep under pride and shame. "No," I said, keeping my tone low, "I don't want you to feel bad. I want you to feel capable. I want you to see that you're not helpless, just comfortable. There's a difference." I slid the empty envelope toward him. "This is what's left, son. Not of my money, of my patience. Of the space I have in me to keep pretending this is okay." He stared at it, his jaw working. "You're cutting me off," he muttered. "No," I said, "I'm setting you free." He laughed then, sharp, bitter. "Free? Free to what? Starve? Free to learn?" I said quietly. "Free to try. Free to fail and still come back, not as a beggar, but as a man who stands on his own 2 feet. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath, and I could feel the wall rising again between us. But this time I didn't try to climb over it. I just stood my ground. After a long silence, he asked, almost whispering, "What if I can't do it?" That question, that one, broke something open in me, because behind it wasn't arrogance but fear, the same fear I once had when his mother died, and I didn't know how to raise a boy alone. "Then you'll fail?" I said simply. "And you'll try again. That's how we all learn, son. You think I didn't fail. You think I didn't cry myself to sleep wondering how to feed you, but I didn't run. I didn't wait for someone to hand me the answer. I built it piece by piece. That's what being a man means." He didn't say anything after that. Just sat there, staring at the receipts spread across the table like evidence of a crime. We'd both committed, me for giving too much, him for taking too often. I told him about the old job postings at the hardware store downtown, how the manager owed me a favor, how I could put in a word for him, but only if he went himself and asked. He nodded absently, but I could tell he wasn't ready to admit he needed the help the right way. When he left that afternoon, he didn't hug me, didn't even say goodbye. Just walked out the door, shoulders hunched, face tight with something between anger and shame. I watched him go from the porch, the same porch where I'd once stood, holding his bike steady, while he learned to ride. Back then he'd fallen hard, scraped his knee, and looked at me with tears in his eyes, saying, "It hurts, Dad." I'd told him, "Good, that means you're learning." Now, all these years later, those words came back to me, sharper than before, because I knew he was hurting again, and maybe that meant the lesson had finally begun. That evening the house felt heavier than usual. I sat in my chair, the one that creaks when I shift, and looked at the envelopes on the table. The empty one still sat there, untouched. I thought about calling him, apologizing, telling him I didn't mean to be so harsh. But I stopped myself. Love isn't about rescuing someone every time they stumble. Sometimes it's about letting them fall, just enough to remember what standing feels like. Days passed, no calls, no visits. I tried to distract myself, gardening, fixing the leaky faucet, volunteering at the shelter. But every night when the house went still, I'd find myself staring at my phone, waiting for a message that didn't come. I told myself this was what I wanted, for him to learn independence, but the truth, I missed him. Missed his voice, even when it carried guilt. Missed the sound of his laughter echoing down the hall, even if it was short-lived. A father's heart is a strange thing. It can be both broken and proud at the same time. 1 week later, just as I was settling into the quiet, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Tyler standing there, hair unkempt, clothes wrinkled, eyes red but alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice low, of course. I said, stepping aside. He sat down at the same table, but this time there was something different in his posture, shoulders squared, chin lifted. "Dad," he began, "I got the job. My breath caught at the hardware store." He nodded. "Yeah, I went. Told them you sent me. They said they'd been short. Staffed and took me on part-time. It's not much, but it's something." I smiled, a slow, proud smile that I hadn't felt in a long time. "That's all it needs to be," I said. "Something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. "I know it's not what I owe you," he said, sliding it across the table. "But it's the first I've earned in a while. I want you to have it." I looked at that bill, wrinkled, small, insignificant in number, but priceless in meaning. "Keep it," I told him. "Start your own stack." He shook his head. "No, Dad, you've carried me long enough. Let me carry something for once." And right then, I knew the lesson had taken root. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, about pride, about the kind of love that survives hard truths. That night as he left, he turned back and said, "Thanks for not giving up on me." I smiled, watching him walk to his car, not as a lost son, but as a man beginning to find himself. And when the door closed behind him, the house felt full again, not because of noise or company, but because, for the first time in years, my heart was light. The weeks that followed felt like watching spring return after a long winter, slow, hesitant, but full of quiet promise. Tyler started coming by again, not to ask for anything, but just to sit, talk, and sometimes help around the house. The first time he showed up after work, I almost didn't recognize him. His shirt had grease stains. His hands were rougher. His eyes tired but alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. He walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, mine just the way I liked it, no sugar, extra hot. "Figured you could use one," he said, setting it on the table. That small gesture, that simple cup, meant more to me than any of the money I'd given him over the years. It wasn't about caffeine. It was about thoughtfulness, effort, presence. He stayed that night longer than usual, telling me about the people at the hardware store, how one of the old mechanics, Earl, had taken him under his wing, how he'd started to feel a kind of pride in earning his own paycheck. I listened, nodding, smiling in places, holding back tears in others. Every word he spoke felt like a small step back toward the man I'd always hoped he'd become. And yet, even as joy stirred in my chest, a shadow lingered, the kind that comes from knowing how fragile redemption can be. Because change, real change, doesn't happen in one good week or one honest paycheck. It happens in the grind, the everyday choices that no one claps for. I tried not to hover or meddle. Instead, I encouraged him gently, asked questions that didn't sound like interrogations. "You liking it there?" I'd ask. "Yeah," he'd say with a shrug. "It's honest work." Sometimes that's all he'd say, but it was enough. Honest work! Those two words carried more meaning than any long explanation could. One evening, he came over with a small envelope. He slid it across the table the way he used to slide bills toward me when he was asking for help. Only this time, his eyes were different, clearer, steadier. "That's $50, he said. "It's not much, but I told you I'd start paying you back. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him to keep it, that he didn't owe me anything, but I stopped myself. This was part of his journey, taking ownership of his mistakes, of his growth. So I took the envelope, nodded, and said, "Thank you, son. That means a lot." He smiled, a small, almost shy smile, and for a second I saw the boy he used to be, the one who ran to me after every scraped knee. Except this time he was standing tall. Still, progress is never without pain. A few weeks later, he missed a shift at work, got caught up with old friends, the kind who don't want to see you do better than them. I found out when his boss called me, yes, called me, because I was listed as his emergency contact. He's a good kid. The boss said, just needs to learn to show up when it counts. I thanked him for letting me know, then sat by the phone for 2 hours, waiting for Tyler to call. When he finally did, his voice was shaky. "Dad, I messed up," he admitted. I took a deep breath before answering. "I know. What matters is what you do next." Silence stretched across the line. "They said they'll give me another chance if I show up tomorrow." "Then show up," I said. "Don't waste that grace." He didn't. The next morning, before dawn, I watched from the window as his car pulled out of the driveway, headlights cutting through the fog, and I whispered a quiet prayer to the empty house. "Please, God, help him hold steady this time." He did. Slowly he started saving. Small amounts at first, 20 here, 40 there. He told me he'd opened a savings account, and though the balance barely filled a tank of gas, the pride in his voice filled the room. I could tell he was learning not just the math of money, but the discipline of value, the difference between need and want. He even started bringing groceries sometimes, got a deal on chicken. He'd say, setting the bags down with that same half grin I'd missed for years. "Thought I'd make dinner tonight." And just like that, the roles began to shift. The father, who'd always given now, began to receive. And I'll be honest, it felt strange at first, humbling, but also healing. Then came the day that would test both of us. It was a Saturday morning when Tyler showed up, quieter than usual. He sat down, fidgeted, and said, "Dad, I've got something to tell you." My stomach dropped. Years of disappointment had trained me to brace for bad news. But what he said next caught me off guard. "I'm moving," he said. "Earl offered me a full-time position in another town. Better pay, benefits, housing assistance. I think I should take it." For a moment, I just stared at him, torn between pride and fear. He was finally getting his life together, but it meant he'd be gone. The selfish part of me wanted to say no, to keep him close, to hold on to this new version of him I'd waited so long to see. But I knew that love, real love, sometimes means letting go even when it hurts. I smiled or tried to. "That's wonderful, son," I said. "I'm proud of you." His eyes softened. "You really mean that?" "Of course," I said. "It's time you built your own life. Just promise me one thing." He leaned forward. "Anything?" Don't forget where you came from. Not this house, not this table, not the lessons we learned the hard way." He nodded, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long, long time. Gratitude. Not the kind that's spoken, but the kind that hums in silence. The week he packed, I helped him load the boxes into his car. It wasn't much, just clothes, tools, a few keepsakes. When we closed the trunk, he turned and hugged me, not a quick, polite hug, a real one, long, tight, filled with everything words can't carry. "I'll visit Dad," he said against my shoulder, not just on payday. I laughed through the lump in my throat. "You better not, I'll start charging for hugs." He laughed too, the sound of it cracked something open in me. It had been so long since laughter in this house felt clean. That night, after he drove away, I sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The same stars I used to point out to him when he was little. That one's the North Star, son. No matter where you go, it'll guide you home. I thought about how the years had changed us, how grief had turned me into a giver, and guilt had turned him into a taker. But now, maybe for the first time, we'd found balance. The lesson had cost us both something, pride, peace, comfort, but it had given us something far greater, respect. I didn't hear from him for the first couple of weeks. I told myself he was just busy settling in. Still, every time the phone buzzed, my heart jumped. And then, one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, it rang. His name I picked up. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice lighter, warmer. "Just wanted you to know first paycheck cleared today." "That's so," I said, smiling into the receiver. Yeah, I paid my bills, stocked the fridge, and still had enough left to take a coworker out for lunch. Feels good. He hesitated, then added, "I get it now, what you were trying to teach me." And I swear, in that moment, something in me finally rested. All the sleepless nights, all the arguments, the worry, the heartbreak, it all suddenly made sense. The lesson wasn't about money, it never was. It was about love with a backbone, about teaching a man to value not what he's given, but what he earns. And hearing him say he understood that was worth more than every dollar I'd ever handed over. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long while, the kind that doesn't ache any more but hums with peace. I realized I hadn't lost my son. I just needed to stop rescuing him long enough for him to find his own way back. And he did. That night before bed, I took out the 2 envelopes from that day, the thick one with the receipts and the empty one I'd used to make my point. I opened the thick one, pulled out the papers, and fed them into the fireplace. As the flames caught, I whispered, "Debt forgiven." Then I took the empty envelope, wrote his name on it, and tucked it into my drawer, a symbol not of what he owed me, but of what he'd become. And for the first time in a long, long time, I slept without worry, proud, content, and certain of one thing. My son had finally learned the value of love, work, and dignity. The house felt heavier after Tyler left, not in a sad way at first, but in that quiet, echoing kind of emptiness that settles when life changes its rhythm. I'd gotten so used to his footsteps in the hallway again, his voice breaking the stillness, his laugh spilling into the living room like sunlight through half-closed blinds. Now the mornings stretched longer, the coffee pot stayed half full, and even the dog seemed to pause at the door every time a car passed, hoping it might be him. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something softer, deeper, like the space between 2 notes in a song. I was proud of him, more than I could ever say, but pride doesn't fill silence. It doesn't keep you company when the night air presses against the windows, and the world outside keeps turning, while your little corner stands still. I tried to keep busy mowing the lawn, fixing that leaky faucet in the kitchen, organizing old photo albums. Funny how you can spend a lifetime collecting memories you never really look at until you're alone. I found one picture of Tyler when he was maybe 6, missing front teeth, holding a fishing pole twice his size, grinning from ear to ear beside me on that rickety old dock by the lake. I remembered how he begged to go fishing every weekend that summer, not because he cared about catching anything, but because he loved the sandwiches I packed and the stories I'd tell between casts. I looked at that photo for a long time that morning, tracing the edges with my thumb, wondering when exactly the boy in that picture grew into the man who once only called when his wall, it was empty. Life doesn't give you a timestamp for that kind of change. It just happens slowly, like water wearing down stone. One evening, a few weeks after he'd moved, I sat out on the porch watching the sunset, that same orange wash across the sky that always reminded me of his favorite popsicles when he was little. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and for the first time, it wasn't Tyler, it was Earl, his boss. Just thought you'd like to know. He said, "Your boy's doing good. Real good. Hard worker. Folks around here like him." I thanked him, my throat tightening. "You have no idea how much that means to hear," I said. "Well," Earl chuckled, "I figured a father ought to know when his son's making him proud." After we hung up, I just sat there, letting those words wash over me like a long, awaited rain. Maybe I hadn't lost Tyler to distance. Maybe I'd simply passed him into the world, the way every father eventually must. Days turned into weeks, and then into months. Tyler kept his promise. He called every Sunday, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 50. We talked about his work, his co-workers, the tiny apartment he was fixing up. One Sunday, he told me about a woman, just a friend, he said, but his voice gave him away. Her name was Mia. She worked at the front desk, helped him file his paperwork for benefits, and apparently made a mean chili. I smiled, listening to the way his tone changed when he said her name. "She sounds nice," I said. "She is," he replied after a pause. "And she doesn't care where I came from, Dad. She just likes who I am. That right there, that's the kind of sentence that makes every struggle worth it." Because it meant he was finally seeing himself through someone else's eyes, not as a man who needed saving, but as one worth knowing. Then came Christmas, the first one we'd spent apart in years. I'd always been the one to cook, to set the table for two, even in the lean years when money was tight and emotions tighter. That year, the table stayed empty. I told myself it was fine, that it was time for him to build his own traditions, his own life. But as I sat by the fireplace, the TV flickering low, I caught myself glancing at the clock every half hour. He finally called around 9. "Merry Christmas, Dad," he said. I could hear laughter in the background, plates clinking, a woman's voice calling his name. "You sound happy," I said. "I am," he replied, "but I miss you." Those 3 words undid me. I didn't cry, not then, but I felt something melt in my chest, something I didn't even know had frozen. "I miss you too, son," I said softly, "but hearing you sound happy, that's the best gift you could have given me." The new year came and went quietly. I started volunteering at the community center, helping a few young men who reminded me a little too much of Tyler, restless, angry, searching for shortcuts. They'd show up in wrinkled shirts, asking about job leads, or just needing someone to talk to. I'd share my story, not all the details, but enough to let them know I understood. Sometimes I'd tell them the hardest part isn't finding work. It's finding yourself worth working for. A few of them would nod. Others would roll their eyes. But 1 or 2 always came back the next week. And every time they did, I thought of Tyler, of how far he'd come, of how close I'd come to losing him before learning how to let him stand. Maybe this was my way of paying that lesson forward. One afternoon in early spring, I got a package in the mail. Inside was a small wooden box, handmade, smooth to the touch, with a note on top. It was from Tyler. The handwriting was familiar, messy, but determined. "Dad," it said, "I made this in my spare time. Earl taught me how to use the shop tools. Thought you might like it for your keepsakes." I opened the box, and inside were two things: a fishing lure, worn but polished clean, and a photo. The photo was of him standing by a lake, holding a fish, smiling that same toothy grin he had when he was 6. I couldn't help but laugh. The lure? It was the same one we'd used all those summers ago. The one he'd lost in the water one July afternoon. I remember how he'd cried that day, how I told him, "It's just a lure, son. We'll get another." He must have gone back and found one just like it. Or maybe he'd made it himself. Either way, it wasn't about the lure. It was about the memory it carried. That night, I set the box on the mantel beside the family photos, and for the first time, I realized something: this house didn't feel empty anymore. It was still quiet, yes, but not lonely. It felt peaceful. Because the silence that once reminded me of loss now felt like proof of something sacred. Growth, distance, independence, love that didn't have to shout to be heard. Then, one Sunday, out of the blue, he said, "Dad, I'm coming home for a visit." Just like that. No build-up, no explanation. I felt my heart leap. "You better," I said, chuckling to hide how much it meant. He laughed. "I'll bring Mia. You'll like her." I smiled at the thought. "If she makes that chili you talked about, I'm sure I will." When I hung up, I sat there for a long moment, staring at the photo of us on the dock. The boy who once only came home on payday was now coming back on purpose, not for money, not out of guilt, but out of love. And maybe that's what every parent wants in the end. Not repayment, not gratitude, just presence. The silence that used to hurt me now felt like the space between chapters, not an ending, but a pause before something new. When Tyler pulled into the driveway that Saturday afternoon, it was as if time folded in on itself, like the years between his leaving and his return collapsed into a single heartbeat. The sound of his car door shutting echoed through the yard, and I stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the frame the way I used to when he came home from high school football practice, sweats oaked, and smiling, only now he wasn't a boy anymore. He stepped out wearing a clean flannel, jeans that actually fit, and a quiet confidence that didn't need announcing. And then I saw her, Mia. She had kind eyes, the kind that saw people before judging them, and when she smiled, I understood immediately why he'd spoken of her the way he did. She carried herself with the warmth of someone who'd weathered storms, and still managed to find sunlight. Tyler walked around the car, opened the trunk, and without thinking, I went down the steps to help. "Hey, old man," he said, grinning as he reached out. I took his hand firm, sure, and for a split second, all the years of disappointment, distance, and heartache just disappeared. "You made it," I said. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, and I believed him. Inside, the house seemed smaller, like it had been holding its breath, waiting for him to fill it again. I'd cleaned up, made chili, the recipe he said Mia loved, and even set out the good plates, the ones his mother used to keep in the cabinet for company. The air was thick with nostalgia and something gentler, like closure in progress. As we sat around the table, I watched him move, the way he reached for things, how he laughed, how he spoke to Mia with ease and respect. I realized then that he wasn't the same man who used to visit only on payday, looking for help, dodging responsibility. No, this was someone else entirely, someone grounded, calm, whole. It made me proud, but it also made me ache in a way I didn't expect. Because seeing your child truly grow up means recognizing they don't need you the same way anymore. After dinner, we sat out on the porch, the three of us. The evening sky stretched wide, streaked with the last light of day, cicadas humming in the distance. Mia sat beside Tyler, leaning into his shoulder, and he looked over at me with that same quiet gratitude I'd seen the day he left. "Dad," he said after a while, "you ever think about how much you taught me without even realizing it?" I chuckled. "Not sure what you mean." He smiled faintly. You taught me that love isn't just about giving. It's about believing someone can do better, even when they've disappointed you." His voice wavered a bit, and I felt that old sting behind my eyes. "I used to think you were hard on me, that you didn't trust me. But now I get it. You were trying to make me strong enough to stand on my own." He turned toward Mia, who nodded as if she'd heard all these words before. "I needed to fail to understand that," he added quietly. "But you never stopped being there, even when you stopped helping." For a moment, I couldn't find words. My throat felt thick, my heart too full. I looked at him, my son, and realized I wasn't looking at a boy anymore. I was looking at a man who had finally come full circle. "I wasn't always right," I admitted softly, "but I did the best I knew how. I just wanted you to be okay." He smiled, reached over, and put a hand on my shoulder. "You did more than that, Dad," he said. "You saved me." The stars were just starting to show, and I looked up at them, remembering the nights we used to lie in the backyard, pointing at constellations. "That one's the North Star," I told him, and now here we were again, older, quieter, but still guided by the same light. Later that night, after they'd gone to bed in the guest room, I wandered into the living room and stood by the fireplace. The little wooden box he'd sent me months ago was still there. I opened it, touched the lure, the photograph, and smiled. The house wasn't lonely anymore, it was alive again. But as I stood there, another feeling crept in, a bittersweet awareness that this, too, was temporary. Tyler was building his own life now, and that was exactly what I'd wanted. Still, a small, selfish part of me wished I could freeze time right there, keep him home, keep the laughter echoing through the rooms, keep this sense of wholeness that had been missing for so long. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Tyler was in the kitchen, humming, making breakfast, eggs, toast, the works. "Morning, Dad," he said, flipping a pancake with the kind of ease that only comes from confidence. Mia's still sleeping. Thought I'd surprise her. I leaned against the counter, watching him. "You've changed," I said. He grinned. "Yeah, I guess I have. In a good way," I added, "in the best way." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I had to lose myself to find out who I wanted to be." I nodded slowly. "That's how most of us learn." We ate together, just the two of us, and for a while it felt like old times, father and son, sharing quiet conversation over breakfast. He told me he'd been saving for a small piece of land outside town, wanted to build something of his own one day. "Nothing fancy," he said, "just a place that's mine." I could hear the pride in his voice, not the boastful kind, but the humble kind that comes from building something with your own two hands. "You'll get there," I said. "I know," he replied, smiling, and I did know because he finally believed it himself. Before they left that afternoon, Mia hugged me tightly. "You raised a good man," she whispered. I smiled, fighting emotion. "He did that himself," I said, but deep down I knew we'd both played a part. My lessons, his choices, life's rough edges sanding us both into something stronger. When Tyler came to say goodbye, he looked around the house, his eyes soft. "You ever think about moving closer to me, Dad?" he asked. I laughed lightly. "You trying to get rid of me or take care of me?" "Neither," he said, smiling. "Just want you around more." That right there, that was all I'd ever wanted to hear. Not out of obligation, not because it was payday or guilt, but because he genuinely wanted me in his life. "We'll see," I said. "For now, this house still has a few stories left in it." As they drove off, I stood in the doorway again, just like when they arrived. The car disappeared down the road, the sound of the engine fading into the hum of afternoon. I didn't feel empty this time. I felt full of love, pride, and the quiet peace that comes from knowing you did something right, even if it took years to see it. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of laughter, and I swear, for a moment, it was like hearing the echo of a little boy calling out, "See you soon, Dad." And I whispered back, "I'll be here, son, always." That night, as the stars came out, I realized something I wish I'd understood sooner, that parenthood isn't about control or sacrifice. It's about faith, faith that the seeds you plant, even through tears and frustration, will one day bloom into something beautiful, maybe not on your timeline, but right on life's. Tyler had learned his lesson, but so had I. Love, after all, isn't about what you give. It's about what you teach by letting go. It began quietly, the way most things that change your life do. A shortness of breath one morning while I was sweeping the porch, a twinge in my chest when I bent down to pick up the newspaper, a fatigue that clung to me like a shadow no matter how early I went to bed. I told myself it was nothing, just age catching up, but deep down I knew better. The doctor confirmed it a week later. A weak heart, he said. Manageable, but not reversible. Funny thing about getting older, it's not the pain that gets you, it's the realization that your body has started speaking a language of goodbye. I didn't tell Tyler right away. He had his own life now, his own responsibilities, and I didn't want to weigh him down. But every time he called, every "Hey, Dad, how are you doing?" felt heavier to answer. "I'm good," I'd say, forcing cheer into my voice. Keeping busy, I told myself I was protecting him, but maybe, in truth, I was protecting myself from the look I knew I'd see in his eyes if he found out. The look that says time is slipping through our fingers, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. The days grew quieter, slower. I still kept the house tidy, still went to the community center a couple of times a week, but the walks got shorter, the stairs steeper. Some nights I'd wake up with my chest tight, the silence of the house pressing down like a weight. I'd sit by the window, watching the moon spill silver over the yard, and think about all the years I wasted trying to control life instead of simply living it. I used to think strength meant holding everything together, the family, the finances, the facade of being fine. But now, sitting there in the half-light, I realized that true strength was in admitting fragility. It was in letting go, even of your own fear. Tyler called one Sunday like always, and for the first time he noticed something in my voice. "You sound tired, Dad," he said. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, then said, "Just a bit worn out. Nothing to worry about." But I heard the pause on the other end, the kind of silence that isn't absence but awareness. "I'll come visit soon," he said. "No rush," I replied. "You've got your own life." "It's not a rush if it matters," he said softly. That night I sat for a long time in that sentence. It's not a rush if it matters. A week later, I heard his car pull up. No warning this time, just him, standing at the door with that familiar stubborn look I used to mistake for defiance, but now knew was love in disguise. "I told you I'd come," he said, stepping inside with a bag of groceries. "You didn't have to drive all this way," I said. "Yeah, I did," he replied simply. I tried to brush it off, but when I saw the concern flicker across his face as I sat down slower than usual, I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. Over dinner, I told him about the diagnosis. He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at his plate, jaw tight. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to worry." I said, "You've got enough on your plate. You're my father," he said, voice trembling slightly. "That's never a burden." The next morning, I woke to the sound of him fixing the porch steps that had been creaking for months. I stepped outside and watched him work, focused, steady, every movement careful. "You don't have to do that," I called out. "I know," he said. "I want to." There was something poetic about it, him repairing the very steps that had carried him out of my life once, now making sure they'd be strong enough to hold me up. That's when it hit me. The circle had closed. The boy who once came home only when he needed something was now giving without being asked. It wasn't grand gestures, it was the small, consistent acts that spoke volumes. Cooking dinner, mowing the lawn, making sure I took my medication. He didn't fuss or hover. He just showed up, quietly and faithfully. like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd said aloud. As the weeks passed, I found myself teaching him things again: how to fix the old radio, how to prune the rose bushes, how to tell when rain was coming just by the smell of the wind. "You always knew that?" he asked once, laughing as the first drops hit the porch. "Some things you just feel," I said. "Like when it's time to come home." He looked at me, eyes glistening, and nodded. That night we sat together in the living room, watching a baseball game neither of us really followed, but it didn't matter. The quiet between us wasn't awkward anymore, it was sacred. One evening I found him sitting at the kitchen table, going through my bills and sorting things into neat piles. "You don't need to do that," I told him. "I know where everything is." "I know you do," he said, "but if something ever happens, I want to be prepared." I almost told him to stop, that I wasn't going anywhere, but the truth caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "You've become the man I always hoped you'd be." He looked up, his eyes soft. "Only because you taught me how to be one." The words landed in my chest like a benediction. It wasn't just gratitude, it was acknowledgement. A full circle moment I never thought I'd live to see. One afternoon I took him out to the lake, the same one from that old photo, the same dock where we used to fish when life was simpler. The dock creaked beneath our feet, weathered but still standing. "You ever miss being a kid?" he asked. I smiled sometimes, but mostly I just miss the days when I didn't realize how fast it all goes. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I used to be angry at you," he admitted, "for being hard on me, for making me figure things out the hard way. But now I see, you were just trying to prepare me for this, for life." I didn't answer right away. I just watched the sun dip lower, turning the water gold. "I made mistakes," I said finally. "But I never stopped loving you." "I know," he said quietly, "and I never stopped needing you." When we got back to the house, I noticed something new in him, a steadiness, a quiet strength. He didn't just carry my groceries inside. He carried the weight of years, the unspoken forgiveness, the understanding that sometimes love is taught through pain. That night I fell asleep in my chair while he cleaned up the kitchen, the sound of dishes clinking faintly in the background like a lullaby. And as I drifted off, I thought about how life has a strange way of humbling us, of making us the teachers and the students all at once. I'd spent so long trying to show him what responsibility looked like that I never imagined he'd end up showing me what grace feels like. The next morning, as he packed to head home, he hugged me longer than usual. "You take care of yourself, all right?" he said. I smiled. "I've got a feeling I'm in good hands." He laughed softly. "You always will be, Dad." And as I watched him drive away, I didn't feel fear or sadness this time. Just gratitude, because for the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what would happen when I was gone. I knew he'd be okay, and that's all any father ever really wants. That night I sat by the window again, the same place where all my worries used to live, and for the first time the silence felt like peace, not loneliness. Time was whispering now, yes, but not with dread. It was whispering thank you. It's strange how life starts to slow down when you begin to see the end more clearly, how ordinary things suddenly feel sacred. The sunlight spilling across the kitchen table in the morning, the creak of the porch swing, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the quiet of night. They all start sounding like prayers. I could feel my body getting weaker, though I tried not to show it. Every step felt heavier, every breath shorter. The doctor's visits became more frequent, the medicine bottles more numerous, and the days a little less predictable. But there was peace in it, too, a quiet acceptance that I'd fought my battles, raised my son, and somehow, despite all the missteps, we had found our way back to each other. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of leaving things unsaid. So one afternoon, I decided to write Tyler a letter. Not a long one, not filled with advice or warnings, just a few simple truths. The kind a father only realizes when he's lived long enough to know what truly matters.
Son,
I wrote, "You've become everything I hoped for and more. I used to worry about what you'd make of your life, but now I see you've made something beautiful out of both of us. Don't mourn me when I'm gone, just live well. That's how you honor me." I sealed it, put it in the top drawer beside the old photograph of us at the lake, and went about my day, feeling oddly lighter. Tyler didn't know how bad things had gotten until one Sunday when I didn't pick up the phone. He called once, twice, then again. The fourth time I answered, but my voice came out thin, strained. "Hey, son," I said, trying to sound normal. "You okay?" he asked, panic bleeding through his words. "I'm fine." I lied, "Just tired." "I'm coming over," he said immediately. "No, you don't have to. I'm coming," he said again, firm, and before I could argue, the line went dead. A part of me wanted to protest, to tell him not to drop everything, but another part, the father part, the human part, was grateful. It's a strange comfort, being loved enough that someone won't take your word for it when you say you're fine. He arrived that evening, headlights sweeping across the yard like a searchlight, finding what's been lost too long. When he came through the door, he looked different, older somehow, steadier, like life had shaped him into the man I always knew he could be. "You should have told me," he said softly, setting down his bag. I smiled faintly. "Didn't want to worry you. That's not how this works anymore," he said, voice cracking just slightly. "You don't carry this alone, Dad. Not anymore." For a moment, the roles reversed. He was the caretaker now, the steady hand. He made me tea, helped me to bed, sat beside me like I used to when he was little and sick with fever. I could see the fear in his eyes, the helplessness I once felt for him, and I realized then that the lesson had come full circle, that love, at its core, isn't about who's giving or receiving. It's about showing up, again and again, even when it hurts. Over the next few days, he stayed by my side. He cooked, cleaned, even joked to lighten the air. We talked about everything, childhood memories, his plans with Mia, the house he wanted to build one day. "You'll come see it, right?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "If I can," I said with a smile. "You better." He replied, and we both laughed, though there was a catch in his voice neither of us could ignore. One evening, I woke to find him asleep in the armchair beside my bed, head tilted back, breathing slow. I watched him for a long time, this man who'd once been a reckless boy, now sitting vigil like a guardian. I thought about all the years we'd lost, all the anger and pride that had stood between us. It all seemed so foolish now. "Life is too short to waste on silence, Tyler," I whispered, and he stirred awake. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Come here." He leaned closer, and I took his hand. "You did good, son," I said softly. "Better than good. You made me proud." His face crumpled, eyes glistening. "Don't talk like that, Dad." "I have to," I said, "because one day, when I'm not here, I need you to remember it, every word." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "I'll remember." We sat there for a while, the silence between us not empty but full, full of everything we'd ever said, and everything we didn't need to anymore. The next morning, I asked him to take me to the lake. He hesitated, the drive was long, and I was weak, but I insisted. "One last time," I said. He agreed. We packed light, just a blanket, a thermos of coffee, and the old fishing rod that hadn't seen water in years. When we got there, the air smelled of pine and memory. The dock was still there, though older, just like us. He helped me down the steps, one slow stride at a time, until we reached the edge. We sat in silence for a long while, watching the sunlight dance on the water. "You know," I said finally, "this was always my favorite place, not because of the fishing, but because it's where you used to look at me like I could do anything." He smiled faintly. "You still can. I shook my head, chuckling. No, son, now it's your turn. We didn't fish. We just sat side by side, two men bound by blood, by time, by every mistake and every forgiveness. I felt his hand on my shoulder, steady, strong, the same way I used to steady him when he was small. You taught me everything I needed to know, he said quietly, even the hard lessons. That's what fathers are for, I replied. We teach through our flaws as much as our wisdom. Then you did both perfectly, he said with a soft laugh. I smiled, watching the ripples move across the lake. Promise me something, I said. Anything. When I'm gone, don't come here to mourn, come here to remember. Bring your kids someday, tell them stories, make it a place of beginnings, not endings. He swallowed hard. I promise. The drive home was quiet, peaceful. I dozed off, listening to the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of his voice humming along to an old country song on the radio. There was something profoundly comforting about it, like the world was tucking me in one last time. When we reached the house, he helped me to bed, turned off the light, and said, "Good night, Dad." I wanted to say, "I love you," but the words got caught somewhere between my heart and my throat. Instead, I just smiled and whispered, "Good night, son." That night I dreamt of the lake, the water calm, the air still, the sound of laughter echoing across the years. Tyler was a boy again, waving at me from the dock, calling out, "Come on, Dad, you're missing the big one." And in that dream, I wasn't old or tired. I was whole. I woke with tears on my cheeks, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Because no matter how many mistakes I made, no matter how hard the years had been, I got the ending I never thought I'd have, my son by my side, loving me not for what I gave him, but for who I was. And that, I realized, was the last lesson, that love, when it's real, outlives everything, even time. It's funny the way the world quiets down when you're ready to let go. It's not loud or dramatic like in the movies. It's soft, gentle, almost polite. Like the world knows you've carried enough noise, and it wants to give you silence as a final kindness. I could feel my body growing heavier with each passing day. The morning light through the curtains no longer woke me. It just reminded me how many I had left. I wasn't scared, not anymore. The fear had left me the day Tyler came back, the day he stopped being a stranger with my last name and became my son again. There's peace in knowing you've said what needed to be said. But that night, as I lay in bed, my breath shallow, I found myself whispering to the quiet, "Just give me one more Sunday, one more moment to see him smile." The house was dark, the air thick with the kind of stillness that feels sacred. My hand rested on the bedside table, fingers brushing the letter I'd written weeks ago, the one I never had the courage to give him. I smiled weakly, knowing he'd find it when it was time. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is standing in the doorway of the living room, though I don't remember getting up. The place looked different, clearer, lighter somehow. Tyler was asleep in the chair beside my bed again, his head tilted down, his hand still holding mine. There was a strange warmth in the air, like sunlight, though it was well past midnight. I looked down at him, his jawline stubbled, his eyes tired but peaceful, and I felt something in me settle. This was what love looked like, not the kind that demands or expects, but the kind that endures. "Thank you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the words came out loud or just in my heart. "You made me proud." I reached out, touched his shoulder, or thought I did, and in that instant I realized the truth. I wasn't breathing anymore, but instead of panic there was calm. I felt light, free, like every ache, every sorrow had lifted. I looked at him one last time and smiled. "Take it from here, son," I said softly, and the room began to fade like an old photograph losing its color. The silence spoke, not with words, but with peace, the kind that only comes when everything has been forgiven. When Tyler woke up, the morning sun had just begun to seep through the curtains. For a moment, he thought his father was still asleep. The hand he held was cool, but the expression on his father's face was serene, the faintest hint of a smile resting on his lips. Tyler's chest tightened. He didn't cry, not immediately. He just sat there, frozen in that fragile moment between disbelief and realization, staring at the man who'd taught him everything, sometimes the hard way, but always with love buried beneath. Lessons? He whispered, "Dad." Once, twice, his voice breaking on the second. Then came the flood, silent tears first, then sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, years of guilt, regret, and love all crashing through him at once. He held his father's hand against his forehead and whispered, "I'm sorry for everything. I love you." It wasn't the kind of goodbye he'd imagined. There were no grand speeches, no last words exchanged, just quiet, and somehow that quiet said more than words ever could. Later that afternoon, when the coroner had gone and the house was still again, Tyler wandered aimlessly from room to room. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt real. Then he saw the envelope on the bedside table, his name written in his father's shaky handwriting. He opened it carefully, unfolding the letter with trembling hands. "Son," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I've gone where you can't follow, not yet. But don't let that fill you with sadness. I've had a good life, a full one, and a big part of that is because of you." Tyler swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the words that followed. "You taught me without realizing it what forgiveness feels like. You reminded me that family isn't about how often we visit, but how deeply we care. You showed up, and that was enough. So don't waste your life on guilt or what-ifs. Live, laugh, love. And when you think of me, don't cry. Just remember that I was proud, always." Tyler folded the letter slowly, pressing it against his chest, and whispered, "I'll remember." In the weeks that followed, grief became his shadow, quiet but constant. He'd find himself reaching for the phone to call his dad after work, only to stop halfway, realizing there was no one to answer. He still visited the house every Sunday, not out of obligation this time, but out of love. He'd sit on the porch, sip coffee from his dad's old mug, and talk to the air as if his father were sitting beside him. Sometimes he'd laugh at a memory, the fishing trips, the backyard arguments about how to cut the grass, and sometimes he'd just sit in silence, letting the peace of the place wash over him. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in, loved in, sacred. Months later, Tyler kept the promise he'd made at the lake. He brought Mia, now his wife, and their newborn son to that same old dock. The wood creaked under their feet, the water shimmered in the sunlight, and for a moment it felt like his father was right there with them. He knelt beside the little boy, pointing at the horizon. "See that?" he said softly. "That's where your grandpa taught me how to fish. He was a good man, stubborn, funny, and tougher than nails, but he loved me, more than I realized." Mia smiled gently. "He'd be proud of you, Tyler. I hope so," he said, his eyes misting. "Because everything I do, it's because of him." The baby giggled, splashing a hand in the air, and Tyler laughed, a sound full of warmth and memory. He looked out across the lake, the wind brushing his face, and whispered, "Hey, Dad, you see this, we're okay. I kept my promise." And for a moment he swore he felt it, a soft breeze, a whisper in the air, the faint echo of a voice saying, "I know, son. I'm proud of you." That night, as the sun sank low, Tyler sat alone by the dock, the sky painted gold and crimson. He pulled out the letter again, now creased from how many times he'd read it, and smiled. He realized something his father had known all along, that love doesn't end when a heartbeat stops. It lingers in habits, in laughter, in the way we carry the lessons of those who raised us. His father's voice was still there, in the way he spoke to his son, in the patience he tried to show, in the quiet strength he carried into each day. Death hadn't taken his father away. It had only made him eternal, in the places that mattered most. Tyler stood, looking out at the fading light, and said softly, "You taught me a lesson I'll never forget." And as he walked back toward the car, the dock swayed gently behind him, as if nodding in approval, the same rhythm, the same peace, the same love that had carried from one generation to the next. Years passed like pages in an old book, edges worn but cherished, each chapter a little softer around the corners. Seasons changed, houses changed, even faces changed, but the lake, the porch, and the memories stayed. Tyler's little boy, now 5, had his grandfather's eyes, that same curious gray, blue, always searching, always wondering. Sometimes when the boy laughed, the sound would echo through the yard, and for a split second, Tyler swore it was his father's laughter coming back through time. Life had moved on, as it always does, but it hadn't forgotten. It had simply learned to carry the past gently. Tyler had built the home he'd once dreamed of, nothing fancy, just warm, filled with light, family, and the quiet reminders of where he came from. In the living room, above the fireplace, hung a framed photograph of his father holding him as a child, both of them smiling under the summer sun. Beneath it sat that same fishing rod from the old dock, its wood polished smooth by time and touch. It wasn't a decoration, it was a promise, a reminder that some bonds never fade, they just change form. Every Sunday, without fail, Tyler and his son, Jake, drove out to the lake. It became their tradition, just like it had been for him and his father. Sometimes they'd fish, sometimes they'd just sit, watching the ripples stretch across the water like time itself was breathing. "Dad," Jake asked one morning, tugging on his sleeve, "did Grandpa really teach you how to fish here?" Tyler smiled. "He did," he said softly, "but that wasn't the most important thing he taught me." "Then what was?" the boy asked. "Why died?" Tyler looked out at the water, remembering the man who had once sat beside him in this very spot. "He taught me that love isn't about what someone gives you," he said. "It's about how they stay, even when they're gone." Jake frowned, not quite understanding, but he nodded anyway, the way children do when they sense something sacred in a grown-up's voice. "Will you stay when you're gone?" he asked innocently. Tyler's throat tightened. "As long as you remember me," he whispered, "I'll never be gone." That night, after Jake fell asleep, Tyler stood by the window, looking out at the stars. He thought about all the years he'd spent angry, lost, distant, and how forgiveness had turned that pain into something beautiful. His father hadn't lived to see all the ways Tyler changed, but in a way, he had shaped every one of them. The lessons lived on, in patience, in kindness, in the quiet strength Tyler carried through each day. Sometimes, in moments of silence, he'd still hear his father's voice, calm, steady, filled with that dry humor that used to drive him crazy. "You're doing fine, son," it would seem to say. And every time Tyler would smile, because maybe that's how love really works, not in presence, but in echo. Years later, when Jake turned 12, Tyler brought him to the lake at sunrise. The world was still half asleep, the water like glass, the air cool and clean. He handed Jake the old fishing rod, the same one his father had used, the same one that had sat quietly by the fireplace for years. "It's time you learned," Tyler said. Jake grinned, gripping it with both hands. "You think I'll catch anything?" he asked. Tyler chuckled. "Maybe," he said, "but that's not the point." They sat on the edge of the dock, legs dangling above the water, the same way Tyler and his father once had. The silence was soft, not empty. It carried decades of laughter, apologies, and love. Jake cast his line, missed, laughed, tried again. Tyler watched him, his heart full in that way that can't be put into words. After a while, Jake looked up. "Did Grandpa like fishing?" "He loved it," Tyler said, "but not because of the fish, because of the time we spent together." Jake nodded thoughtfully, then leaned against his dad's shoulder. "Then I love it too." The sun rose higher, painting gold across the water. The world felt still for a moment, like time had looped back, giving father and son another chance. Tyler closed his eyes and breathed in the smell of pine and lake water. and for a heartbeat he could almost feel his father there, not as a ghost, but as warmth, as peace. He whispered under his breath, "We did it, Dad. We made it full circle." A soft breeze brushed across the dock, stirring the surface of the lake just enough to make it shimmer, and Tyler smiled, knowing somehow his father had heard him. As the years went on, life unfolded with all its ordinary beauty. Jake grew taller, older, busier, but he never stopped the Sunday visits. Even when school and friends took most of his time, he always made space for the lake, sometimes alone, sometimes with his dad. And long after Tyler's hair had turned gray and his own hands had grown slower, they still sat together, the rod between them, watching the sun rise and set over the same water that had seen 3 generations of them. There was comfort in that, a quiet rhythm that outlasted all the noise of life. When Tyler grew old, he began writing letters to Jake, just like his father once had. Small notes tucked into books, glove compartments, even the old tackle box. Words like, "Proud of you, kid," or "Patience catches more than bait ever will," simple, timeless truths. He didn't want to wait until it was too late to say them. He wanted his son to always know. One winter evening, when Jake was grown and had a family of his own, he found one last note tucked inside that same fishing rod case. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting shaky but familiar. "If you're reading this, son, it means you've carried on what matters most. Not the fishing, not the house, not even my words, but the love. That's all I ever wanted. You made it last. So when your boy asks one day what kind of man his grandfather was, don't tell him I was perfect. Tell him I loved you with everything I had." And that was enough. Jake sat there for a long time, the note trembling in his hand, tears rolling down his cheeks. He didn't feel sad, just full. Full of everything his father and grandfather had built, piece by piece, through lessons, laughter, and forgiveness. That spring, Jake brought his own son to the lake. The dock was older now, the boards soft with age, but the water was the same, clear, patient, endless. "This," he said, setting down the tackle box, "is where your dad learned to fish." "From Grandpa?" the boy asked. Jake smiled. "From Grandpa," he said softly. The boy grinned. "Do you think he can see us?" Jake looked up at the sky, where the light broke through the clouds in gentle streaks. "Yeah," he said. "I think he never stopped." The boy nodded, content, and cast his line into the water. Jake watched the ripples spread out, circles within circles, and in that quiet, he understood why his father and grandfather had always loved this place. It wasn't about catching anything. It was about remembering that love, like water, always finds its way back home. The wind picked up softly, rustling the trees, carrying the scent of pine and memory. Jake closed his eyes and smiled. Somewhere, he swore he heard it, a faint voice, warm and proud, whispering, "That's my boy." And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like anything was missing. The story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about connection, the invisible thread that runs through time, binding father to son, generation to generation, heart to heart. It had all come full circle, and in that gentle peace love lived on.